Okay, so chapter 6, an introduction to metabolism. So metabolism is the totality or the sum of all of an organism's chemical reactions. And so in each one of these reactions are catalyzed or sped up by a different enzyme. So this is kind of like a process here where your reaction is A gets converted to ultimately D. And so A, here's your initial starting molecule, and here's your product. And so that's what we're going to end up with. And so oftentimes there's a series of reactions to get to from one point to another, and each one of those reactions is catalyzed by a different enzyme. So enzyme 1 speeds up reaction A to B, enzyme 2 B to C, enzyme 3 C to D, and so on. And there are all kinds of reactions going on in your cells of your body all the time that need to be sped up by these enzymes. And so metabolism is the name for all of those reactions going on at any given time. So it manages the materials and energy resources of a cell. Now, there are two different types of pathways. So this is called a pathway. It's a series of chemical reactions. There are what are called catabolic pathways, and these guys release energy by breaking down, so I'm going to underline that, breaking down complex molecules into simpler ones. So the digestive enzymes that we've talked about in class break down food and release energy. And so that would be one example of a catabolic pathway. And anabolic pathways, on the other hand, consume energy. They use energy, or energy is needed to, in this, I'm going to underline here, build complex molecules from simpler ones. So amino acids link to form. What do amino acids link to form? Proteins, right? So like, let's say, use a specific one from our body, muscle protein, all right? And so protein being the big thing there that amino acids are linked to make. So I'm going to put here, let's see the diagram. So see the coloring picture that I had given you. So that looks like, let me grab it here, that looks like this. So find this, all right, and it tells you what is what in here, and this is the picture I want to look at. So what we're looking at here is a part of the cell. So here's the cell membrane. This is inside the cell, and this is outside the cell. And so this is the extracellular fluid and so on. All right, so let's talk about these molecules out here. It says simple organic molecules. So these molecules are coming to the cell and are going to go into the cell and be used. And so let me give a specific example. Let's say we eat starch. Let's say you eat a roll or something like that. It has starch in it. And remember that starch is a chain of glucose molecules. So glucose hooked to another glucose, hooked to another glucose, etc., etc. All right, dot, dot, dot. Okay, so when you eat starch, you chew it, you swallow it, and it begins digestion. And so we're going to digest the starch. And so when we digest starch, what do we do to it? Well, it's one big long chain of glucose. When we digest it, we break those bonds between the glucose molecules. Remember, by adding water to break them, like hydrolysis. So it breaks down the glucose. And so now we have individual glucose molecules no longer connected together. Glucose, glucose, glucose floating around here. All right, so that's what these guys are. So these are your individual glucose molecules. And glucose, if you remember from the last chapter, how does it get through and into the cell? Can it go through the lipid bilayer? Your answer should be no, it can't go through the lipid bilayer, but it can get in. So how does it get in? By a protein that's facilitated diffusion. So glucose is going to enter into the cell. So that's how it gets in there, and it's going in there from high to low concentration. So that is facilitated diffusion. That is a form of passive transport. So then it can be used in one of two different ways. All right, so it can be used here and here. All right, so let's look at each one of these. I'll put them in different colors so that like is separate here. So here we have an anabolic pathway. That's what this is. We just wrote about that. So anabolic pathways consume energy. They use energy to build complex molecules from simpler ones. So this glucose is going to be used, these simple organic molecules. I use the glucose as an example. In this case, glucose would specifically be used to make starch. So starch, this would be in plants, if this is a plant cell, or the glucose can be hooked together to form chains of glucose, and what do we call that in animals? It is glycogen, or glycogen, and this is in animals. So the glucose is going to come in here and build starch, and then or glycogen, and so that is anabolic because to hook them together, it's going to require some energy input. All right, that's not going to happen all by itself. Now, let's say the molecule coming in is not glucose; it's another organic molecule. So, what organic molecule would be used to make proteins? Amino acids, right? And so if this is, we could say we eat protein, digest it into amino acids, it comes in here and is used to build protein. So that's another molecule that's made. We can make DNA, fats, phospholipids. As long as we have these dots here are the different smaller molecules that are used to make that. So fat is made from a glycerol molecule and 3 fatty acids. So when we eat fat, we digest it into, when we eat fat, we digest it into glycerol, 3 fatty acids. They come in here and we rebuild them here. All right, and so then in the phospholipids and so on, DNA is a chain of nucleotides, so you'd hook nucleotides together here. So long story short, we're building these molecules from smaller molecules. That's anabolic. All right, pathway. But we said that requires energy. Where does that energy come from? That energy comes from our other pathway here, our catabolic pathway. So in this case here, glucose, we're going to break glucose down in my example. Break down glucose, which remember is C6H12O6. Into, what are we going to break it down into? So we have some molecules here. So here we have water. So this is a water right here, into water. And we have to have something that's made out of carbon, and it is carbon dioxide. To water and carbon dioxide. And so this is a process called cellular respiration. In the process, energy is released. And so the H here, all right, stands for, if you look up here, heat energy. And so this is heat energy. Now, is heat energy useful for the cell? No. So we call this unusable energy. Heat energy. So a lot of the energy, so glucose has a lot of energy stored in the bonds holding the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens together. And when it's broken down into smaller molecules, that energy that was once in glucose, energy doesn't just magically disappear. It is, in this case, released and converted to another form of energy, which is heat energy. And then some of that energy is usable, and that's the energy used to drive the anabolic pathways that need energy. So this is the energy to do work. All right, so a lot of that energy is released as heat, and some of that energy goes to do work. And so if you think about, like, when you need a lot of energy, like let's say when you're exercising, you are using up and you're breaking down glucose to get energy to do work for you, all right? And so therefore, think about what happens when you exercise. You get hot, right? And that's because you're going through this catabolic pathway called cellular respiration to get energy to do work. You're moving or running or whatever you're doing. You're getting energy to do work, but in the process, a lot of that energy that was once in your glucose is released as heat energy, and so therefore your body heats up. Okay? And so those are the relationships between catabolic and anabolic pathways. All right? So I like that picture just to show the relationship between those two. All right? So catabolic releases energy. I always think of, one other thing I forgot to say, I always think of catabolic pathway when you're trying to memorize terms and stuff like that, it's breaking down glucose. So catabolic pathways are always breaking down something. It doesn't necessarily have to be glucose, it's just breaking down something. I just chose glucose as an example. I always think of like a big cat chowing down, eating a like rabbit or something like that. It's breaking apart in its food and so on and chewing it. And so cat has catabolic, has the word cat in it, and so that was my silly way of remembering it. Okay, so if that helps you, great. All right, so let's move on here and talk about this energy. So energy is the capacity to do work. And there are different forms of energy, and so this is going to be a little bit of a review, hopefully, for you. So kinetic energy, or KE here, energy associated with, and that's motion. Energy of motion. And so we've talked about this already in this class with diffusion and so on. But there is a type of kinetic energy called heat or thermal energy. Heat or thermal energy, and this is due to the random movement of atoms and molecules. And so as heat increases, as the movement increases, heat increases, and so on. And so that kinetic energy, heat is considered a form of that. And then there's potential energy, which is stored energy. And it can be stored energy as a result of its position or structure. So, for instance, when I just went over glucose here and breaking down glucose and that there's energy in the bonds of the glucose molecule, that is potential energy. It's energy stored in the bonds of the molecule, and this is due to its structure. And so, therefore, that's what that means. Energy due to position. So, for instance, let's go through this example here. This diver on this board here has more potential energy on the platform than in the water, and it's just because of its position, his position on the diving board. And so the potential energy here, they have more potential energy or energy available to do work because of its position. Let me give an example of that with back to this picture here with the Metabolism coloring book picture here. There's a person on the second floor with a book, and they drop the book. The book has more potential energy on the top than on the bottom, and that's because it has potential energy using, due to it being on top, like it could be used to bring up another book as a weight here to bring up another book. It would not be able to do that on the ground, and so therefore that's another example of potential energy due to position, all right, as well as the diving board. So then energy can be converted from one form to another. So you can convert chemical energy to mechanical energy and heat energy and electrical energy and so on. So in driving a car, we do that. We start out with chemical energy and gasoline, and then that chemical energy is ultimately converted to energy, mechanical energy. It can be converted to electrical energy. It could be converted to kinetic energy in terms of movement of the car. It can be converted then to heat with applying the brakes, and so on and so forth. So we can convert one form of energy to another, and this gives an example with the diver here. So they have potential energy when they dive. Notice there it says diving converts potential energy to kinetic energy, so he's moving. Now he has less potential energy in the water than he did on the platform, but then climbing up is now converting the potential energy in the body to the energy of motion of the muscle movement, and so on, and then eventually you have potential energy again, and so on. So the fact that energy can be converted from one form to another, there's a whole area of study called thermodynamics. So thermodynamics is the study of energy transformations. So in looking at this, you can have two different types of systems. A closed system, like liquid in a thermos, is isolated from its surroundings. So the idea is that there's no interaction between the inside and the outside, and therefore, ideally, if there was really completely closed, there would be no transfer of anything from the inside of the thermos to the outside of the thermos. So if you put in hot liquid in your thermos and there's no interaction, it should stay hot forever. And so that would be a closed system. On the flip side, you could also have an open system. Energy and matter can be transferred between the system and its surroundings. And so what are organisms? Are they open or closed? Organisms are for sure open systems. So let's turn the page here. So let's look at, there's two laws, the first and the second law of thermodynamics. So the first law, I'm sure you've heard this, that the energy of the universe is constant. So you've probably heard of that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So energy can be transferred and transformed. It cannot be created or destroyed. Okay, that's also called the principle of conservation of energy, is the first law of thermodynamics. So energy just goes transferred from one form to another, but it never disappears and you can't create it from nothing. All right, so the second law of thermodynamics, every energy transformation increases the entropy. Now this you've probably never heard of. Entropy is the disorder of the universe. So every energy transformation or energy transfer, some energy is unusable, often lost as heat. And so what happens is, before I talk about the bear picture, let's just go back to this picture here that we've already talked about. Like you have glucose here at the beginning, and we broke it down into water and carbon dioxide. So all the energy was once stored nice and orderly in the glucose molecule, but once we break it down into water and carbon dioxide, and some of that energy is released, some of it's used to do work, but a lot of it's released as heat. So you can see that the disorder of the universe has increased because we have broken down a very orderly molecule. So before we broke it down, there was less disorder because all that energy was in the glucose molecule. We break the glucose molecule down, and now we've got that energy that was once orderly in the bonds is now converted to heat, and heat is the most random, disorderly type of energy you can have. And so therefore, the universe, the world, has become more disorderly because of that energy transfer. All right? So that's what that means here. Every energy or transformation increases the entropy or disorder of the universe. So the entropy is constantly increasing of the universe. And that's because of that being lost as heat. So the same idea here with the bear eating the fish. There's chemical energy molecules in the fish, but now when the bear eats the fish and breaks the molecules down into simpler molecules like this, and then he breaks it down and uses those molecules to do work for the bear, a lot of the energy is used as heat. So he's using the glucose being broken down into carbon dioxide and water, so he's breathing that out. And a lot of that energy, like this picture here, a lot of the energy is released as heat that's going into the universe, and so therefore increasing the entropy. All right, so those are your two laws of thermodynamics. So we're going to relate this to something called free energy. And oftentimes it's called Gibbs free energy. All right, so if you see that. Gibbs free energy is the part of the system's energy available to perform work. So all that heat energy that's being released when we break down glucose is not able to do work. So basically what we have to do is say how much energy is in the glucose molecule to begin with, And then how much of it is released as heat, and what's left over is the energy available to do work, all right? And so that's what we're going to do here. So the change in free energy, or delta G it's called, so G is free, stands for free energy, during a process is related to the change in enthalpy, or total change in total energy. So that's delta H. Delta means change, so final minus initial, total energy. And the change in entropy, which is the disorder, and delta S is due to entropy. Now notice here T, it says change in entropy, and then it has T, and this is the temperature in Kelvin. We're going to explain in just a second about why that's important. So we have this equation. So what we have here, delta G, is the change in free energy. So this is the energy to do work. So I'm going to write in words here what's going on here. So delta G is the energy to do work. So basically, to figure out how much energy is available, let me go back to this picture here. To find out the amount of energy available to do work, we take the total energy, so that is the H part, all right? So we take the total energy and minus the entropy, the disorder. So that would be, in my example over here, the amount released as heat. So that's unusable. And so we take the total minus the heat and give you the energy to do work. But now, so notice here with T, Y is T, you multiply that by entropy. So can you see that what happens when the temperature increases? What happens to the disorder? It also increases the kinetic energy and of molecules begin to increase. So therefore, the amount of entropy is directly related to the temperature. So therefore, as the temperature goes down, there's less disorder. As the temperature goes up, there's more disorder. And so that's why we multiply it by T, which is temperature in Kelvin. So therefore, we're going to put minus unusable energy. And the unusable energy is in part decided by the temperature. All right, is affected by the temperature. All right, so what does this mean, delta here? And so what we're going to look at is it's a change in, and so we're going to look at initial versus final state. And so how do they figure this out? So what we're talking about is initially how much energy do you have minus how much unusable energy, and so on. So what you would do is take the total energy to begin with, that's HI, and then HF. All right, so to figure out delta G, we could take the total energy, and change is always final minus initial. So final minus initial, and then you'd have a number here. All right, and then minus T delta S. So the delta S is, again, S initial, how much entropy at the beginning of the reaction, how much entropy at the end of the reaction. And so you could do final minus initial here, plug that in, multiply it by the T, and you can get your energy to do work. So if you're given this information about a reaction, you can say, okay, this was initial, plug that in, this is final, and I could do delta H and delta S and plug that in and figure out the energy to do work. All right, sometimes, though, they'll actually give you what the initial G is. So therefore, G is H minus T delta S. So if I'm going to multiply that by T here, because really that's that part of the equation. So if I take H initial minus T S initial, I get my G initial, how much energy is available to do work at the beginning of the reaction. So how much total energy there is minus the unusable energy gives me my energy to do work. And I do the same thing here for my final. So final minus, so H minus, this gives me G final. So another way to calculate the delta G is G final minus G initial. All right, and so if you're given these numbers, you can just do that and get the change in free energy. All right, from the beginning of the reaction to the end of the reaction. So if we have here, I just put a generic reaction here. Initial, we have molecule A and B are converted to C and D. So this on the left-hand side is your initial state. So that's what I was talking about here. So how much total energy do we have here, and how much entropy do we have here? And we can find out the G in the initial state. And then same thing with C and D in the final state. So therefore, there's two main equations here for figuring out delta G. This is equation number 1 right here, and this is equation number 2. These both are going to give you the same end result, but sometimes you don't have to use this one. If you're given G initial and G final, you can just use this. If you are given this information, then you have to calculate it this way. All right, so those are two equations to figure out how much energy is available to do work. So free energy is a measure of a system's instability, or it's a tendency to move to a more stable state. The more unstable something is, the more work and more energy you have. And so therefore, what's going on in this picture here with glucose, glucose has a lot of energy in it. That's because it's more unstable. It's not very stable compared to when it breaks down into water and carbon dioxide. These are more stable molecules. And so therefore, the more unstable they are, then the more energy they have. And when they break down, energy can be released, and then some of the energy can be used to do work. Some of the energy is used or is released as heat. So unstable molecules are good in terms of harnessing energy and being able to do work. So that's what that means about its instability. So during what we call a spontaneous change, and I'm going to explain that in just a minute, free energy decreases and the stability of a system increases. And so so when free energy decreases, that means the amount of energy available to do work decreases, and the system becomes more stable. So let's go back to this picture, or go to this picture here on the next page. So this picture here shows you three different things. We have a person on a diving board diving off, so we've already talked about that. We have molecules diffusing, so they're all congregated in one area and they're diffusing to another area. And we have a bigger molecule being broken down into smaller molecules. So my question is to you, which ones, the ones at the top or the ones at the bottom, have a greater work capacity? Usually have the ones at the top. So here, these guys have a greater work capacity. So this is has less work capacity. Now, if you have a greater work capacity, what's true about your free energy? Is it higher or lower? It is higher. So there's a greater work capacity. Greater or more free energy, let's say. I'm stuck on that word greater. More free energy. So that means that there's a higher G, right, which is free energy. So you have higher ability to do work up here, which means you have a greater free energy, or higher G, than when you're in the water down here. The molecules on one side have a greater work capacity here, and the molecule, this would be like glucose that we just went over, being broken down into carbon dioxide and water, has a greater work capacity or more free energy here. So therefore, let's write here that there's less free energy, which means you have a lower G. And so, what we're doing is going from in terms of stability, a place where are these guys here more or less stable than here? Up on the diving board, are they more or less stable here to here? They're less stable here. So, and going to a state of more stability. And so that's what happens in reactions. So this is like the glucose to carbon dioxide and water. So therefore, going back over here, all right, free energy decreases and the stability of a system increases. All right, so we're going to a more stable state. But once we get where we're at a stable state, then the thing is that no work can be done. And so therefore, free energy is a measure of the system's instability. And so we rely on that to be unstable. So when we have maximum stability, that's when equilibrium is reached. So we don't really want equilibrium to be reached because then no work can be done. And so a process is spontaneous and can perform work only when it's moving towards equilibrium. So like this process here, all right, from more less stable to more stable. So remember, free energy, that G is the part of a system's energy available to perform work. All right, so that's the change in free energy. So let's look at a couple of different types of reactions and how the free energy measures up. So the two types of reactions are exergonic and endergonic. Now, in chemistry, you probably sounds familiar with exothermic, probably. And so this is exergonic, energy is released. And so in this case here, this is considered a spontaneous reaction. And so let's look at the exergonic reaction, here at this particular graph here. So let's look at what the graph is showing us. This is the progress of reaction. So this is really time. So this is the beginning of the reaction. This is the end. So beginning and end. And this is your free energy. So this is the G, right? This is the amount of energy available to do work. So you have your reactants at the beginning of the reaction and you have your products. So notice here the reactants, the amount of free energy in the reactants is high. All right, and we call this at the beginning of the reaction, that is G initial. That's the amount of free energy initially at the beginning of the reaction. Here for the products at the end, this is how much free energy they have, energy available to do work, and that is G final. So notice, remember that we talked about one of the reactions is delta G is G final minus G initial. And so when we look at here, if we look at final, so the products have lower free energy than the reactants. And so therefore, so I'm going to write here that this is lower. So they measure this in a number here. So there's a lower number here minus the initial has higher free energy. So this is going to be a higher number. So when you take, so that's the delta G. So when you do this, a lower number minus a higher number, what type of number are you going to get? You're going to get a negative number. And so, let's talk about why that is. So where does that energy go? Remember, we talked about the law of thermodynamics that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. And so what's going on here is that energy is released. So the reactants have a lot of free energy, more free energy. The products have less. That difference, where does that go? It just doesn't disappear. And so this is the amount of energy released. So let me just go get a different color here. So the energy released is that energy here. So that's and the amount is the difference between the free energy in the products and the reactants. And so therefore, delta G is less than 0, and that's where we just calculated that as a negative number. And so, so whenever you see a negative number for delta G, that's telling you something about the type of reaction, that it is exergonic, energy is released, and it's spontaneous. So spontaneous, what's always true about it is energy is released, that the final products have lower free energy than your reactants. Okay? And so if we look at the opposite, let's write that up here. Forgot this part here, that delta G is, what are we going to put? Less than 0. So the opposite type of reaction is an endergonic reaction. This absorbs free energy. So it uses energy. And what do you think the delta G is going to be here? Well, let's go look at it on the flip side here with this particular graph. And so here you have, again, the progress of reaction. So this is your beginning, this is your end, and here's your reactants and the amount of free energy. That's your GI, and this is your products have more free energy, and that's your GF final. And so in this case here, the products have more free energy than the reactants. So where in the world does that energy come from? That energy, we have an input of energy. So energy is required. That's why it says here energy required. And this would be a non-spontaneous reaction. And so, so when we do the delta G equals GF minus GI, we have F is higher, so this is a higher number, minus I, which is a lower number. So you take a higher number minus a lower number, you're going to get a positive number every time. And so therefore, this right here is what this is here. As the delta G is greater than 0. So this is the amount of free energy required to make for the reactants to turn to products. So this energy has to come in from the environment and be taken in so that the products have more free energy. Because remember, energy is neither created nor destroyed. So if these products have more energy, that energy has to come from somewhere. And so that's the difference, the reactants and the products. And so when a reaction is endergonic, you're going to always have a positive number. Now, if you recall, when I first introduced free energy over here, that there were two reactions, or two equations, and so we just did it with the GF minus GI, and I want to address this really quickly here, because you can figure out delta G if you know the total energy and the entropy. So let's do that for each one of the exergonic and endergonic reactions here. So if we look at and use this information to use delta G equals delta H minus T delta S. All right, so let's talk about delta H with the exergonic reaction. So delta H is the total energy. So delta H is final minus initial. And so the total energy, final minus initial. So final has lower total energy than initial. And so therefore you have a lower number minus a higher number. So if you have a lower number minus a higher number, what are we going to get? A negative number. And then let's look at the other part of the equation, T. So the temperature can fluctuate, but the delta S is S final minus S initial. And so let's talk about the entropy of the universe here. All right, so initially, a lot of energy is tied up in the bonds of the molecules here. And then afterwards, the products have less free energy, but a lot of energy was released. And oftentimes, remember we said that a lot of that energy can be released as heat. So some of it can be used in a reaction. Whoops, why did I do that? To be released as heat. And so what happens is when in an exergonic reaction, only part of the energy is able to do work, the free energy, so that's the amount able to do work, but some of that energy is going to be released as heat. This graph isn't showing you the heat energy, but in exergonic reactions, some of that will be released as heat. So therefore, in an exergonic reaction, after the reaction occurs, what has happened is that we've increased the entropy of the universe. And so therefore, the final entropy, the disorder, is higher than the initial. So you have a higher number minus a lower number, and we get a positive number. So let's relate how that goes to with this equation here. So I'm just going to rewrite it again here. All right, so we have a negative number here for delta H for an exergonic reaction, and then minus T multiplied by a positive number. So we're going to have here a positive number. So you have a negative number minus a positive number. So every time, what are we going to get? We're going to get always a negative number. And so therefore, doing this gives us the same result as this equation here. All right, so getting a negative number. And so let's relate that to the endergonic reaction in the same way. And so in the endergonic reaction, let's look at delta H. So H final minus H initial. And so in this case here, final has more energy than initial, so it's a higher number minus a lower number, so I'm going to get a positive number. And delta S is the entropy. So what's happening to the entropy here? So S final minus S initial. Can you tell me what's going on with the entropy? And so what we have here is it taking in energy from the environment and putting it into a more orderly, so it could be heat that speeds up this reaction, taken in and converting to product. And so therefore, what's going on is at the end, there's actually less entropy than here. All right, and so therefore, the final, there's less entropy than the initial. So a lower number minus a higher number, what kind of number do we get? A negative number. So let's see how that relates to the second equation. So delta G is equal to delta H minus T delta S. And so when we look at this, we're going to have a positive number here minus T multiplied by a negative number, so a negative number. So when you subtract a negative number, what kind of number do you get? A positive number, right? So delta G is going to be a positive number every time, and that kind of goes with this here. All right, and so therefore, two different ways using this equation. Let's get green here. So we have the two equations, this equation and this equation, calculating the same thing. All right, and then same thing with this. I'm going to just highlight this equation and this equation. All right, they're both figuring out delta G in different ways. All right, but it shows you how we get that and arrive at the same end result. All right, and that's where I'm going to stop with this video.